pleasure today to have Todd May with us. Professor May is currently teaching at the New School, although he otherwise teaches at Clemson University. He has been there since 1991, and he specializes in continental philosophy, especially recent French philosophy. He has, as modestly said, just tell them that I wrote a bunch of books. He has written on Michel Foucault, Deleuze, Rancière, and his political philosophy of post-structuralist anarchism has been influential in recent progressive political thought, and his work on Rancière is among the first in English. Professor May's writings also seek to bridge the gap between Anglo-American and continental styles of philosophy that developed in the early 20th century. His teaching interests are varied. He has found himself teaching classes as diverse as anarchism, the thought of Merleau-Ponty, resistance, and alterity in contemporary culture, secular ethics in materialist age, and postmodernism and art. And without further ado, Professor May, the floor is yours.
First, let me thank the organizers of the Radical Democracy Conference for inviting me. It's a real honor to be able to be here. My plan is to speak for just about half an hour or so, because I want to leave a lot of time for discussion of the ideas. I just want to put some stuff on the table for us to be able to talk about. And let me also, as a preliminary, apologize in advance that there will be no citations from Castoriadis. And to my great relief, there will be no conceptual support sought from Zizek. That seems to be important for me. I want to start with a quote. I'm going to read the quote twice because, in fact, the quote's the centerpiece of the paper. It's a quote from Rancière's Hatred of Democracy. The quote is this: democracy, first of all, means this: anarchic government, quotes, one based on nothing other than the absence of every title to govern. And just again, democracy, first of all, means this: anarchic, quote, government, one based on nothing other than the absence of every title to govern. Let me note that that's, I've got the French, and that's essentially a transliteration, not just a translation from the French, so I will spare you because you don't want to hear me try to speak French. This talk can be read as an attempt to understand the above sentence, its meaning, its motivation, and its significance for the theoretical tradition of anarchism. Among major recent French thinkers, only Rancière has been willing to align his thought openly with the term anarchism. Foucault, for instance, a thinker one might consider anarchist, at least in his inspiration, dismisses the movement with a brief gesture at the end of one of his lecture series, equating it with a racist form of biopower. Only Rancière has been willing not only to reject the Marxist specter, which often hovers over progressive European thought, but to refer in a positive way to a tradition that during most of the 20th century was thought to have been left in the dustbin of history. With a return to anarchism in political action, and more recently in political thought, Rancière's gesture of embrace is both timely and deserving of reflective attention. He has much to offer contemporary anarchism, and his thought can be better understood in dialogue with that now renewed tradition. Understanding the meaning and significance of the above sentence will require some hermeneutical work. Rancière's pronouncements, while not entirely gnomic, are a bit, one might say, programmatic in character. His texts are often short and suggestive. This, one might argue, is in keeping with the requirements of his thought. It seems to imply the equal intelligence of his readers. His writings do not tease us with obscure references or jargon, and neither do they explain themselves exhaustively. This invites the reader to engage with his texts. But this invitation is one not only to read, but also to think and to work. One might consider this essay to be an acceptance of that invitation. Rather than being a violation of Rancière's presupposition of equal intelligence, I hope this essay will be read instead as one person's attempt to see what can be made of the role of anarchism in Rancière's text. One might begin reflection on the citation by noting the paradoxical character of the phrase anarchic, and then in quotes, government. There is a double difficulty here. First, anarchists are often thought to be opposed to government, so it appears that there may be a contradiction that's operative in phrase. Second, however, and opposed to this, the term government itself is placed in quotes. indicating that something other than a traditional view of government is at stake. Indeed, the term government is used in one sense literally, and in another sense it seems more figurative. Later in his chapter on hatred of democracy, from which the quote comes, Rancière tells us, quote, "Democracy is neither a society to be governed, nor a government of society. It is specifically this ungovernable on which every government must ultimately find itself to be based." End quote. Democracy, then, in Rancière's view, seems both to be and not to be a matter of government. In what sense is democracy a matter of government, and in what sense not? The sense in which it is a matter of government has to do with the entitlement to govern. Rancière refers to Plato's discussion of entitlement to govern from the laws, where Plato distinguishes 7 forms of entitlement. The first 6 are unsurprising, right? They have to do with birth, power, and strength. It is the 7th one that catches Rancière's attention. Quote, this is from the laws, "The title of that authority that has the favor of heaven and fortune, the choice of the god of chance, the drawing of lots, that is, the democratic procedure by which a people of equals decides the distribution of places." End quote. But the drawing of lots is not a qualification at all. It is precisely the absence of qualification. It is pure luck, the favor of heaven. As Rancière points out, this implies, right, that one of the entitlements to govern is nothing other than the absence of any specific entitlement. It falls to those who receive it not by virtue of some quality they possess, but simply as the product of a random selection process. But if one of the 7 entitlements to govern is the absence of any entitlement, then what does this imply for the other 6? What status can they have as justifiers for the position of governing if they stand alongside the absence of any entitlement? It is though one said that the entitlement to govern lay in having a particular quality that justified governance, or not having any such quality. The existence of the 7th entitlement undercuts the justification for any of the others. Or, to put it another way, there is no justification for an entitlement to govern. Anyone at all is entitled to govern. To say that anyone is entitled to govern, however, is not the same thing as saying that no one is entitled to govern. It is instead to say that everyone is equally entitled to govern. This begins to get us to the meaning of the citation. If there is to be some kind of government, it must be had on the basis of a recognition that everyone is equally entitled to that government. Or to put it another way, there is no justifiable distinction between those who occupy the position of governing and those who do not. As Rancière puts the point in disagreement, quote, "Political activity is always a mode of expression that undoes the perceptible divisions of the police order by implementing a basically heterogeneous assumption, that of the part that have no part, an assumption that, at the end of the day, itself demonstrates the contingency of the order, the equality of any speaking being with any other speaking being." End quote. This, however, does not allow us to understand the significance of the quotation marks around the term government. It does not enlighten us as to how democracy both is and is not a matter of government. It only tells us that nobody is any more entitled to govern than anyone else. However, if we attend to the citation about the ungovernable, on which every government must ultimately be based, we have our clue. Immediately preceding the citation, one that I said at the outset, beginning, democracy is neither, Rancière writes, quote, "State government is only legitimate insofar as it is empirical. It is political. It is political only insofar as it reposes merely on an absence of foundation. That is what democracy means when accurately understood as a law of chance. The customary complaints about democracy's ungovernability in the last instance comes down to this. Democracy is neither, quote. The complaints about democracy's ungovernability that had taken up much of the earlier part of hatred of democracy are complaints about people's unworthiness to govern themselves. Allow people to choose their government, and they all become animalistic consumers, dedicating themselves to the first pleasure that comes along. Rancière turns this idea on its head. The complaints about democracy's ungovernability are, in fact, complaints about democracy itself. They are complaints about that democracy, as he puts it, reposes merely on an absence of foundation. They are a form of resistance to the idea that everyone is equally entitled to govern, an attempt, through a denigration of the people, to reintroduce the idea that there are some more worthy of governing than others. There are those who are capable of governing, and others who are not. In fact, those others are hardly capable of governing themselves in their own private lives, much less governing anybody else in the public arena. These latter are, in the terms of disagreement, those who do not have a part, or those who do not count. The fact that democracy is a denial of this distinction between those who do and those who do not have a part to play in governance is precisely what the elites hate about it. The ungovernability characteristic of democracy, then, is the equality upon which every attempt to govern must rest. Even when it denies that equality, it nevertheless presupposes it. This is an argument Rancière makes at the outset of disagreement. He writes, quote, "There is order in society because some people command and others obey. But in order to obey, to obey an order, at least two things are required. You must understand the order, right, and you must understand that you are to obey it. And to do that, you must already be the equal of the person who is ordering you." End quote. The presupposition of equality is the presupposition of ungovernability. It is not the ungovernability of those who are too unruly to govern themselves, but instead of those who are equal to those who seek to govern them. It is, we might say, a normative rather than descriptive ungovernability. If we keep in mind that the recognition of that normative ungovernability is often an explanatory element in the arising of what Rancière calls politics. If ungovernability is the characteristic feature of democracy, then when Rancière places quotation marks around the term government in the citation at the outset, does he mean that we should take the term ironically? We think of democracy as a form of government. By anarchic, quote, government, does he mean, in conformity with the idea often associated with classical anarchism, that democracy is not a matter of government at all, and that therefore there should be no government? I want to claim that matters are a bit trickier than that. And to hold on to the idea that democracy in one sense is not a matter of governance, and in another sense it is. We might approach the idea by saying this, that if there is to be anything like democratic governance, it must reflect the ungovernability just described, the ungovernability that lies in the equality of every speaking being with every other speaking being. Much of what goes under the name of democracy is nothing other than a betrayal of that ungovernability. And that is perhaps why, when Rancière writes Hatred of Democracy, he focused not upon those who offer their empty encomiums to democracy while betraying it at every turn, but instead upon those who find democracy to be a threat. These latter, at least, have in their sights the radically unsettling character of democracy, even if, for their own reasons, they fail to see it aright. As we saw a moment ago, the claim that everyone is equally entitled to govern is not the claim that nobody is entitled to govern. The question before us then becomes this: what would be a form of governance that reflected the idea that everyone is equally entitled to govern? What would an anarchic form of governance look like? It might very well in one sense be a form of governance. At certain points, some might be entitled to give orders to others, who might in some sense be obliged to obey them. On the other hand, it would not be a form of governance that presupposes that those giving the orders would be entitled to those orders in the sense of being justified by any quality they possessed. If they were justified to give any orders at all, that justification will have to rest on another basis. This, I want to claim, is why it is that the term government is placed in quotation marks. It is not because Rancière wants to mark any irony with respect to the term, but instead because the idea of governance based upon democratic ungovernability is not at all the same thing that we have come to associate with any form of government with which we are familiar. And how might such a governing order look? The central feature would be that everyone is considered equally capable of governing. This would require that, in some form or another, each person has a say in the ongoing governance of the group. That say can happen in many ways. The most forceful expression of this might be said to be a consensus form of governance, where anyone in the group could veto a group decision. However, it is not clear that consensus in fact does preserve the equality of everyone. One might ask whether the veto power creates an inequality between those who favor a proposal and those who are against it. Often, the complaint among groups that work by consensus is that one member can hold up the business of all the others simply by vetoing whatever proposals are made. Another form of governance might appeal consensually to a meta level, to create a consensual agreement on rules of procedure and then proceed from there. A group could, for instance, consensually agree on a set of rules that allow for a majority or a supermajority voting on a variety of issues. This would circumvent the problem of consensus without marginalizing any of the participants. It would be a form of government somewhat akin to the discursive community endorsed by Jürgen Habermas, who promotes a view of norm setting that requires the actual ratification of those involved in the group. To be sure, we must distinguish Rancière's thought from that of Habermas. In disagreement, Rancière argues that Habermas reduces politics to a rational balancing of interests. Habermas, this is now Rancière, quote, locks the rational argument of political debate into the same speech situation as the one it seeks to overcome, the simple rationality of a dialogue of interests, end quote. This undercuts the dissensus of politics, which seeks to challenge a particular order of interests in the name of equality, rather than to operate within it. I don't wish to challenge this point of Rancière's, which is well taken. It operates, however, on a different register from the discussion here. For Rancière, one challenges a police order in the name of equality, and Habermas's thought, by promoting consensus, fails to accomplish that. In the discussion at hand, the one that we're interested in now, we are already presupposing equality and asking what happens within the context of that presupposition. In other words, we are asking about the internal dynamics of subjectification in Rancière's sense of the term, that is the challenge to the police order in the name of equality. This meta-level approach is not without its own challenges. First, is it possible? First, it is possible, although less likely, to repeat the problem of consensus at the meta level if someone were to decide to veto all proposals for forms of voting. Second, what happens when a new member joins the group? Is he or she, does she or she have a say in the procedural norms? And does that signal that he or she is more or less entitled to govern? There are no easy answers to these questions. However, the fact of their being raised would already indicate a sensitivity to the equal entitlement to govern that lies behind the citation at the outset. The philosopher Mark Lantz argues that equality cannot be assured simply by finding the right process. He claims that it is not only the process that needs attending to, but also the participants in that process. They must cultivate the particular skills that would lead to cooperative deliberation and a recognition and acceptance of other viewpoints. In line with Aristotelian thought, Lantz claims that by developing certain abilities, for instance, to recognize the significance of the viewpoints of others, to have a sense of when to press on and when to let go of one's position, one can become a better participant in processes that seek to ensure the equality of all participants. These virtues, one might maintain, are simply the virtues associated with the ability to recognize the equal entitlement of others. They reflect at the personal level what Rancière envisions at the political level. Inasmuch as processes like these can be developed, there's no reason to think that there cannot be the giving and receiving of orders involved in a form of governance that would still preserve the equal entitlement to govern. For instance, I might be part of a group seeking more rights for undocumented workers, whether or not I'm an undocumented worker myself. The group, with my participation, may have delegated a person as press liaison. At a demonstration, if a member of the press seeks to interview me, it would not violate my equal entitlement to govern for the press liaison to approach the press, turn to me and say, I'll cover this. There would be the giving and receiving of orders, and yet I would be involved in the process by which those powers were delegated. As an example of this form of organization, we can look to the anarchist press collective AK Press. I wrote about AK Press in a recent book on movements that instantiate Rancière's politics. AK Press is located in the urban core of Oakland, California. Its 6,000 square foot warehouse is operated by 8 employees, 5 of them full-time, and also several volunteers. Its statement of purpose reads, quote, AK Press exists to publish and to distribute materials that contribute to social and political changes based on anarchist principles. These principles integrate the abolition of government, the destruction of capitalism, and the replacement of hierarchies and prejudices by constructing egalitarian structures based on freedom, equality, and self-determination. We do not seek merely to criticize or to escape the existing state of the world, but to offer and function, which is important, as a better alternative, end quote. AK functions as a voting collective. All decisions are voted on by members of the collective, 9 at the time when I was visiting in 2008, and a majority decision is binding. One might worry about this procedure, but in fact it works in the collective because of the presupposition of the equality of everyone involved. If there's a split vote, the members of the majority ask for the concerns of those in the minority, and efforts are made to address them. If the concerns are deep ones, and the possibility of compromise seems remote, the majority may and sometimes does abandon its position. Alternatively, those in the minority may express their comfort with being on the losing side, recognizing that the majority has a stake in a particular decision that does not seem deleterious to the organization as a whole. AK has developed not only a process in which there is governance by all with an equal say from each, but also an orientation that does not fetishize process, in Lance's terms, at the expense of the interpersonal recognition of equality among the members of the collective. One might want to suggest here that certain types of liberal constitutional orders would also meet the criterion of equality of governance. Take, for instance, discussed previous session, John Rawls' famous example of the original position, where everyone is asked to choose principles for social governance from behind a veil of ignorance. This would seem to allow equal participation in the setting of social principles. There are, however, 2 problems with this proposal, one specific to Rawls and the other characteristic of constitutional orders generally. The problem for Rawls is that the original position is a theoretical model of deliberation, not an actual deliberation. As Rawls notes, quote, the original position is also more abstract. The agreement must be regarded as both hypothetical and non-historical, end quote. Second, and this is the problem that applies to all constitutional orders, once the governance is set in motion, there are those who are not governing and they lose their status as real participants in the system. They vote, or perhaps run for office, but these choices are between being represented and representing, not participating. As we know from historical experience and from our current situation, representation is usually a betrayal rather than an expression of the equality of governance. It places people in a position of passivity relative to their governance, which creates or recreates the distinction between those who have a part and those who do not have a part. This does not mean that representation can never be utilized in an arrangement of equal participation. One could, for instance, delegate a representative from a smaller group to a larger one in order to facilitate specific decisions. However, a constitutional order that has representatives whose position allows them to make decisions on a variety of fronts with the justification of representing others tends toward a division between the governing class and a government. Moreover, as we have seen to exhaustion, this division is reinforced by and itself reinforces other divisions, especially but not solely economic ones. In any case, absent a constitutional order, there are more informal but perhaps nevertheless stable ways to ensure an equality of governance. Recently, Rancière has recognized this point by distinguishing between institutions and cooperatives. And let me just say as a side point, for several years I bugged Rancière with emails saying, surely you can institutionalize equality at some level. And he sort of put it off until we got to a point where I was asked to do an interview that Rancière would have to respond to. And so now it was all in print. I said, surely we can institutionalize forms of equality. And he did what any good French intellectual would do, which is he didn't say, well, no, I was wrong, right? Because, of course, that was impossible. And therefore, right, he said, no, let me make a distinction between institutions and what I will call cooperatives, right? Cooperatives being what you are calling institutions, and institutions being the thing which I am now going to redefine and keep criticizing. Right? He writes, quote, "The power of the people itself is anarchic intrinsically, right? For it is the affirmation of the power of anyone who of those who have no title to it. It is thus the affirmation of the ultimate illegitimacy of domination. Such power can never be institutionalized. It can, on the other hand, be practiced, enacted by political collectives," end quote. If this is right, there can be forms of governance that sustain the equality of everyone. These forms of governance are nothing like what has traditionally been conceived under the rubric of governance, hence the quotation marks in the opening citation. Nevertheless, they open the possibility of cooperative governance without betraying the one quality that entitles one to govern, that is, the absence of any entitlement to govern. One might raise the objection at this point that groups with governance like this cannot substitute for a constitutional order. They are bound to be too small and dispersed for the kind of governance required over a territory or diverse social grouping of any size. Rancière is sensitive to this point. In his view, a politics of equality, which for him is the only form of politics really worthy of the name, is something that should not be confused with the policing of society. This is why it is, as he says, neither a society to be governed nor the government of a society. Police orders, constitutional or otherwise, will always be with us. However, because these police orders are necessarily inegalitarian, within those police orders, there must always be ground for challenges by and alongside those who are marginalized by a given police order. In Rancière's terms, police orders always invite dissensus. What we are describing here, then, is not a blueprint for a type of governance that is to substitute for what has gone under the name of government. Instead, we are investigating what type of governance can be associated with those who resist a police order, those who act collectively under the presupposition of the equality of all speaking beings. To put the point another way, we are asking about what governments might look like if it were truly democratic. Rancière insists, quote, "The test of democracy must ever be in democracy's own image, versatile, sporadic, and founded on trust," end quote. We are asking here about the character of a governance based on trust, and we should not be surprised that it is necessarily versatile and sporadic. As many of you will likely have suspected at this point, as the discussion has unfolded, it has tracked not only the issue of governance, but at the same time that of anarchism. The types of governments suggested a few paragraphs back are in keeping with those discussed by the anarchist tradition. Anarchism has always been focused on the equality of participants and on the processes by which each participant can have his or her voice heard in the context of political decision-making and political movements. When Rancière uses the term anarchic to qualify governance, his term appeals to a tradition of thought that converges with the interpretation of the passage we have given here. The idea that everyone is equally entitled to govern, that politics is a bottom-up rather than a top-down affair, that the process of decision-making always displays whether or not there is real equality in a particular group, all of these are staples of anarchist thought and practice. This is not to insist that everything Rancière says, at least under the interpretation offered here, is seamless with everything that has been claimed by the anarchist tradition. The reason for this is that the anarchist tradition is itself not seamless. In particular, there has been a deep ambivalence in the tradition between an embrace of liberty and one of equality. I have discussed this issue at length elsewhere and will only reprise the idea quickly here, because I want instead to focus on how the idea of equal entitlement to govern displays itself in an important contemporary anarchist text. The leading idea is that while anarchism has historically split into two streams, individualist anarchism focusing on liberty, which now might be called libertarianism, and collective anarchism focused on equality. The latter group, which is the leftist form of anarchism, is itself often ambivalent about the role that liberty plays. Often, maximal liberty is embraced as a value that converges with equality, when in fact there can indeed be tensions between them, as anyone who has seen the recent effects of unbridled economic liberty will attest. This confusion can be traced to 19th century anarchist thought, where, as the thinker George Crowder has pointed out in his book Classical Anarchism, there is thought to be no tension in 19th century between liberty and equality. In Crowder's view, the classical anarchists of the 19th century hold, quote, the optimistic belief generated by the rise of scientism that moral truth, seen as inherent in the laws of nature, will eventually be the object of universal agreement, end quote. If there is a natural convergence on universal moral agreement, then allowing people to act freely will only enhance the emergence of that agreement. While I think that Crowder underestimates the role that equality plays for the classical anarchists, there is no doubt that there is a bond between the embrace of liberty and an optimism that such an embrace will ultimately not conflict with the equality of everyone. Rancière's thought, with its privileging of equality rather than liberty, stands as a corrective to the legacy of this confusion. Many contemporary anarchists are not prey to this confusion. Colin Ward, perhaps the most seminal writer among British anarchists, describes a form of anarchism that can be seen to reflect the interpretation I have offered here, even though he does not always spell it out theoretically. In the first instance, Ward is not a utopian anarchist. He does not believe, contra someone like Bakunin, that top-down relationships can be overcome through a revolution that simply sweeps them away. Ward writes, quote, the choice between what he calls libertarian, what he means anarchist, and authoritarian solutions is not a once-and-for-all cataclysmic struggle. It is a series of running engagements, most of them never concluded, which occur and have occurred throughout history, end quote. In his view, anarchism is not a new idea. The project of bottom-up struggles on the basis of equality has been with us throughout history. Like Rancière, his examples do not come solely from recent history, but from earlier periods as well. And, also like Rancière, those examples are particular forms of resistance to hierarchy by those who are its objects. One example is close to home for Ward. It concerns a squatter camp that was initiated in 1946 by those left homeless in Britain from World War II. The British government was gradually seeking to address the problem of homelessness, but in Lincolnshire, people took matters into their own hands. They decided to occupy army camps that had been emptied after the war. The movement spread. Ward writes, quote, by October, 1,038 camps had been occupied by 40,000 families in England and Wales, and another 5,000 families in Scotland, end quote. Although the British government initially opposed the movement, claiming the squatters had left their position in line for housing, it eventually offered the camps official recognition, something that, of course, the squatters were not seeking. The camps were run on an egalitarian, bottom-up basis. As Ward describes them, quote, they organized every kind of communal service in the attempt to make these bleak huts more like home. Communal cooking, laundering and nursing facilities, for instance. They also federated into a squatters' protection society. One feature of these squatter communities was that they had very little in common beyond their homelessness. They included tinkers and university dons, end quote. One is reminded, reading of these camps, of some of the spontaneous activity characteristic of the days following Hurricane Katrina. While the media was reporting widespread looting and chaos, most people on the ground and, of course, in the water were organizing informally in order to preserve themselves and their neighbors during a period in which the state, local, and federal governments were exhibiting a staggering failure to act. Right? In fact, if folks have not seen the movie Trouble the Water, which gives an on-the-ground view of how they not only failed to act, they actually got in the way of those trying to help one another. That would make it clear. The difference between Katrina and the squatters' camps lay in the longevity of the latter, the squatters' camps. A longevity that gave birth to informal but sustained organizations, or what Rancière calls cooperatives. In one case, Ward notes, the squatters' camp lasted for 12 years. The history of these squatters' camps not only exemplifies anarchist government of the type Rancière depicts, it also displays the difference between those for whom equality is a presupposition of political action and those who rely on the police order. Ward notes that once the British government officially recognized the squatters' camps, it began to move other homeless families into them. However, these latter homeless families did not have the same relationship to their surroundings as the original squatters. They had not appropriated them, or been involved in their refashioning. In fact, there arose a distinction between what were called the goats and what were called the sheep, the former being the original squatters and the latter the official ones relocated by the government. The former had started from scratch, appropriating the campgrounds, turning it into habitable space. The latter, by contrast, did not have a hand in creating the space. Their government had not only located into the camps, but had also provided some basic improvements, like partitions and sinks. It became evident that those who had appropriated the space were more active in their relation to their surroundings. They, the goats, worked on improving the camps and ensuring their smooth running, while the sheep settled into a more passive and depressed state. This distinction between the goats and the sheep points toward an element of Rancière's thought that we have not yet touched upon: emancipation. The difference between them can be seen as a difference between those who accept and those who do not accept the government's claim that they do not have a part to play in the creation of their lives. After all, the line jumped by the goats was created by the government, who arrogated to itself the role of dispenser of dwellings. The former subject themselves to the police order, the sheep, while the latter do not. Their way of refusing the government's claim did not consist in challenging the government to provide them with housing. It consisted in seeking housing for themselves, that is, in presupposing their equality to those in the hierarchy who claimed to have a part to play. In doing so, they cut not only their legal, but also their, and more importantly, their psychological moorings to the hierarchy governing them. This is in contrast to the sheep, who continue to rely on the police order. In a word, by acting on the presupposition of their equality, the goats emancipated themselves. Rancière writes that living from the presupposition of equality, quote, is the definition of a struggle for equality, which can never be merely a demand upon the other, nor a pressure put upon him, but always simultaneously a proof given to oneself. This is what emancipation means, end quote. Rancière thinks that movements like these, anarchist movements of equality, do not arise often. He writes, quote, politics does often happen, but it happens actually very little or rarely, end quote. I am not sure I agree with this. Elsewhere, I have documented several movements of equality. Zapatistas, the Algerian refugee struggle for equality in Montreal, a local food cooperative near my own home in Clemson, South Carolina. And if you look to Katrina, or the MST, the movement of the landless workers in Brazil to claim unused land for cultivation, or the Argentinian workers' takeover of factories earlier in the millennium, which intersects, I think, what you're talking about, right? One will see the evidence of equality at work. Many of these movements do not call themselves anarchists, and none of them, at least to my knowledge, calls themselves Rancièrean. But right, they exhibit the characteristic presupposition of equality that animate those two forms of political thought. As Rancière reminds us, equality, quote, is a mere presupposition that needs to be discerned within the practices implementing it, end quote. To be sure, politics in this sense may not be as visible as the police order that surrounds us, but it remains a constant theme, what Ward calls one of the running engagements of collective resistance to that police order. The egalitarian, anarchist impulse seems to run deep, which is likely one of the reasons that, among elites, there is such a hatred of democracy. This hatred, as the citation at the outset notes, is a hatred of self-governing, a hatred of governing by those whose qualifications to govern consist in any title to govern, in the absence of any title to govern. To be self-governing in this sense, however, is neither to be without governing nor to submit to a representational form of governing. It is instead to act alongside others in a common creation of governing that stems from a common presupposition of equality. Moreover, it is the emphasis on this form of action emerging from this presupposition that ties Rancière's thought to that of anarchism, and both to some of the most significant and some of the most persistent people's movements of our time.